Alright, this video I'm going to talk about how MBTI, the Myers-Briggs typology test, is useful. So my type is INTP. I'm going to tell you what that means. So that means I'm an introvert, I'm intuitive, I'm a thinker, and I'm prospective. That's a dominant preference. Doesn't mean that I'm like that all the time. Maybe I'm like this 50% of the time. And I'm going to talk about a revision I made of the ideas called combinatoric MBTI. So my primary type is INTP, but I have an order of preference of these typologies. I prefer thinking over intuition, over introversion, over prospection, which means I don't really value prospection very much, which means my first subtype is going to be INTJ. So maybe I'm like this 30% of the time. You can continue this to say that within these possible preferences of the orders of my typology, I prefer the ones that are like ENTJs. So I prefer TNIP and NTIP. So NTIP is second. Third, I might prefer TINP, which corresponds to ISTJ. So if you see this, I don't value P, so those changed into J's. But I also didn't value I and N, so this I turned into an E, and this N turned into an S. But this I and N stayed the same. I see this N and N, I and I, and this T stayed the same on both because I highly valued it. So that's how I'm choosing these based off these selections, which are based off of the preference for a J and a low P. Whereas in this group, my ENTP subtype, I don't value I. So all of these possible combinations for my preference for the order of my typology is I. Each of these subtypes is a 4-choose-2 combination of this of the variation caused by having this preference of a low I. There's 4 of these, so the 4 subtypes an INTP can have are ENTP, INTJ, INFP, and ISTP. And my order of preference happens to be INTJ, ENTP, ISTP, and then INFP. Maybe this means I'm an INFP around 5% of the time, and ISTP about 1% of the time. I think this really has more to do with the way, if you look up videos by a YouTuber called C.S. Joseph, there's a theory for how you would divide the mind into the conscious, the unconscious, the subconscious, and the superego. And there's some useful analogies for describing the cognitive functions that make up these personalities. And once you understand the cognitive functions, then you actually understand the usefulness of the MBTI, because this is what's actually valued. So I suggest you go look up C.S. Joseph on YouTube for all of his great videos on it. But for now, I'm just going to talk about the fact that when you do this combination, which is just a mathematical operation of the way you can mix these preferences up, you get 24. You get 4 times 6. 4 choose 6. 4 where you choose from 2 each time gives you 6. And there's 4 of these because they get mixed based off the bias of the last one. See, last are all T's, last are all N's, last are all P's, last are all I's. So that gives you these. It turns out these are actually just 6 different types, each with a 1/6 probability of you having these in terms of the orders of your preferences. So if you were to go through, like I did, and you see INTJ is your first subtype, you see there's 3 possible from those 6. Every time it's going to be 3 possibles. ENTJ is first because it was my first and second combination. ISTJ is second because it was my third and fifth combination that averaged to 4. And INFJ was my fourth and sixth that averages to 5, so it was my least favorite of those combinations. When you're considering your stack, in this case, mine is INTP, then INTJ, then ENTJ, then ENTP. That's because I prefer this subtype of INTJ more than this subtype of ENTP. And I prefer those subtypes more than my subtypes of ISTP and INFP. Because this is a preference multiple times, my ENTJ, in terms of the way it's ordered, you could technically move this past the INFP if you wanted to just include it in terms of the subtypes, but I'm going by percentage probability that I am that type. And so there's some kind of estimation pretty much after INTJ. If you really just want to understand someone, their personality in general, most of the time, 70 to 90% of the time, all you need to know is their main type and their subtype. Because consciously, that's how they'll behave. But if you want to know everything about how their unconscious mind is working, you'll need to know their entire stack order as a reference, not because you'll need to know the exact position of everything, but just as a reference when you're working with the cognitive functions. Because really this is an analogy for how the mind is divided into 4 regions. The stack is divided into 4 regions, and these correspond to preferences of the conscious, the unconscious, the subconscious, and the superego. So maybe this was a little bit arbitrary in when I put the ENTJ, but I just thought it was a higher percentage overall. So following this rule, on the next subtype I have for ENTP, my preferences for these possible combinations were the ENTJs again, NTPI and TNPI. And then my second preference was the ESTP, which in this case correspond to the TPNI and the PTNI, these two. And then the least one was the ENFP, which was MPTI and PNTI. So because this average is higher than this one, ESTP is going to come before ENFP. And so ISTJ came before INFJ, and ESTP came before ENFP. These are referencing the fact that these two functions are working almost entirely out of the unconscious mind. So the subtype that I have of INFP, my least favorite, of my subtypes, is ENFJ. Well, this one is ESTJ, if you were to follow these rules of how you get the unconscious from the conscious. Basically just flip the first and the last one. That would mean maybe that they're not positioned here, but I kind of arbitrarily positioned them there because these are mostly unconscious to my mind anyways. I thought there might be like a feedback loop, so it might be a good place to position them. It could be that these are more conscious, maybe these should have gone here and these should have gone below. But these percentages, pretty much after you get past the first 4, are probably less than 1 or 2% of your conscious mind. They're really your unconscious mind working. So the order is not really important. It's more the grouping. And so these are grouped into the unconscious mind. These are grouped into the subconscious mind. And these are grouped into the superego. And so I have an ISFP superego. These are just 5 that didn't make it onto the list based off of the combinatoric selection. So I prefer ENFJ more than ESTJ. But I prefer ISTP over INFP. So these are probably really close, very small percentages in my conscious mind, but fairly evenly occupying my unconscious mind. Whereas these, which represents my subconscious mind, are pretty well defined, and these that represent my superego are not well defined at all. I know ESFJ is going to be at the bottom of my stack because it's antithetical. And I know ISFP is like the gateway to my superego, so I put it at the top. But this is arbitrary, I think I have a preference for ISFJ over ESFP, and these are just a preference ordering that I gave it. And so this is just the ordering and came up with my stack. Perhaps these two groups you could flip, but the important thing is how you group them. that they're representative of this idea of the four sides of the mind. And so I don't think it's useful to think of someone as just an INTP, unless you really just want to understand their general behavior quickly. If you're just meeting them and you can't really tell what their first subtype would be, you don't know them that well, then yes, this is a good way of estimating approximately their behavior and preferences and everything. But if you don't have a combinatoric understanding of MBTI, then you'll be limited to the stereotypes of just the functions for one type or the behaviors of one type. Really what you want to do is understand the functions, because the functions are the real progress that Jung made. Everything that we're talking about is really an analogy for the default mode network. The default mode network is just the average brain activity that represents conscious brain activity in the brain. And the brain, so the brain, just from a top view, has this area in the center called the corpus callosum. It doesn't look like this, but I'm just kind of circling it. That inhibits and excites different parts of the brain. And it does this synchronistically or asynchronistically. For example, your nose, so just your nose here, takes turns. There's erectile tissue in both of your nostrils, and they take turns being the one to take in more oxygen. So you can actually test this, but sometimes you can breathe much better through it's about 4 hours that it switches from your left nostril to your right nostril, and it just goes back and forth. Your ears are also variably sensitive to sound. One is more sensitive, and then the other one's more sensitive. This probably relates also to the parietal lobe area, and therefore there's probably more sensitivity in terms of dexterity, but that's minor, probably because you have a preference. Most people have a preference to their left brain because they're right-handed, and that has to do with chirality of the brain, and I won't go into that. But I don't think there's been much analysis, but more than likely your eyes also have a preference based off of this switching between the lobes of the brain and the way that they're coordinated. Every socially complex species on the planet has a corpus callosum. And so any socially complex species with the corpus callosum should have an analogous default mode network that you can kind of linguistically think of in terms of these cognitive functions. And I think that this switching is similar to the idea of the cognitive functions switching in terms of how they loop. So people that get into this language a lot will say, oh, I'm in my TISI loop. I was thinking in terms of archetypal memories, these memories of my past or ideas, and loop back into more thoughts, and then I get stuck and I'm not connecting. I'm not being responsible with my creativity in terms of connecting to other people, to other things, to other new ideas or whatever. And this prevents maturation process, social maturation or whatever in INTPs. Once you get into the NE, then you start to activate FE, harmony, social shared values, averaging the values of other people for the sake of morals. That has to do basically with the maturation of this switching, allowing the other lobe to have some share in the conscious activity of the brain. So when you're immature, it may be... So also if you look up McGilchrist, you can see that the left lobe of the brain is more introverted and the right lobe of the brain is more extroverted in nature, in terms of how it's scanning. This is scanning for space, this is scanning for consistencies in space. So that's the main difference. And your unconscious mind is automatically processing these, so it's activity that's automatically switching back and forth. In my case, it behaves kind of like an ENTJ. I'm not sure if C.S. Joseph or someone else assigned these characters to kind of create a narrative for explaining the cognitive functions, but he talks about for example, for INTPs, TI is the hero, always trying to use logic to explain everything. I like to think of these as positive and negative. These could be hero or villain. Well, a lot of people like to think of the conscious mind as positive and the unconscious mind as negative, just as a balancing point. But I like to think of it as each as positive and negative. So it could be hero or villain. Parents could be like a good parent or a bad parent, a good child or a bad child. This one is surprisingly the only one that people tend to think of in terms of the positive and negative, aspirational or insecure function. And that one's very clear because a lot of people have this underdeveloped. So therefore, they can often feel like an INTP that is insecure about expressing their feelings or harmony, or they can be aspirational to it. So that one's pretty clear. In the unconscious mind for the ENTJ, TE nemesis basically is proclaiming, well, you cannot challenge me in my knowledge. I always will have more knowledge than you. I'm sure that I have more knowledge than you. But I think it can also be an assistant. It can also be a great teacher. NI, critic, can also, I've had a better word for it. It was something like, I'll think of it later, but it was something like encourager or something like that. So instead of criticizing, you can encourage, the INTP can encourage their goal as reinforcement of the correct goal they should be having, instead of criticizing it constantly. SE blind can also be thought of as all-seeing. If you make these in context in terms of TIE or hero, for example, SE blind is seeing the narrative, seeing all possible narratives through logic, whereas an ESFP, which is the total opposite, they are TI blind and SE hero, will see the logic in all narratives. At least that's their goal. It's almost impossible to form the logic of all narratives, and it's impossible to see all narratives through logic. It's just, there's too much. This has to do with actually the fact that the brain is a quantum computer and the way that it processes information, but I can't really get into that. This is just about MBTI. And then FI demon, I also think of it as angel. And that one's pretty clear. It's just because it's a kind of like double aspirational. I think of it as you're trying twice as hard, so you could be twice as insecure, or multiplicatively, and in terms of magnitude, much higher insecure or aspirational about for an INTP of their values. And then these are inverted. So your superego is what happens when you digress into your unconscious and subconscious. It's kind of the balancing force. It's trying to take over the mind, but it's also trying to balance the mind. And then the ESFJ is your subconscious. It's the inversions of these. It's the part of you that is the aspirational FE and the insecure TI, which is usually pretty small. It's in your subconscious. That's acting automatically to tell you when you're behaving the right way, essentially. So I think that was everything. If you have any questions, you can I'll respond to any comments. I studied neuroscience at the University of Michigan. Currently working on some ideas with Professor Aragona. They're not entirely related to all the videos I've been making. But specifically this one, it's not really related. But this is a very useful analogy to the ideas of the localized specializations of the mappings of spaces and consistencies in the brain. So I like to have buzzwords for these. TI is understanding space and logic consistency. NE is creativity space and connection consistency. SI is memory space and archetype consistencies. FE is moral space, is ethical space, and morals perform the consistencies. Morals being the averaging of values in the group. TE is rational space, and knowledge is the consistency factor. NI is vision space, and goals are the consistency factor. SE is narrative space, and perception is the consistency factor, or performance also. This one's hard for me, obviously. And then FI is value space, and imagination space, and values are the consistency factor. So every person has all of the 16 personalities in their mind. Once you understand how to see how they're all a part of you and a part of everyone else, I think it's a better way to understand people instead of just labeling them as one personality.